LinkedIn presents.
Psychologists have found again and again and again that the simple act of chatting with a stranger can make us feel happier and healthier, less lonely, and more connected to the places where we live. One psychologist even found that talking to strangers boosts our cognitive function, making us, in effect, smarter.
Good morning, I'm Michael Kovnat. This is the Next Big Idea Daily. Make sure you're following the show to get new episodes and sign up for our free companion newsletter using the link in the episode notes. So, do you talk to strangers while standing in line? How about that guy next to you on the airplane? Most of us don't, but Joe Cohane says we should. Joe is a longtime journalist and editor, and a couple of years ago, he wrote a book called The Power of Strangers: The Benefits of Connecting in a Suspicious World. In it, he argues that striking up conversations with the random people you encounter in life is actually the cornerstone of civilization, and it also makes you happier and smarter as well. Joe's going to tell us how right after this quick break.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, host of Everyday Better, an award-winning podcast dedicated to personal development. Join me every week for captivating stories and research to find more fulfillment in your work and personal life. Listen to Everyday Better on the LinkedIn Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Jessie Hempel, host of the Hello Monday podcast. Start your week with the Hello Monday podcast. We'll navigate career pivots. We'll learn where happiness fits in. Listen to Hello Monday with me, Jessie Hempel, on the LinkedIn Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
My name's Joe Cohane. I'm a writer in New York City, and I recently wrote a book called The Power of Strangers: The Benefits of Connecting in a Suspicious World. In it, I set out to answer three seemingly simple questions. Why don't we talk to strangers? When will we? And what happens when we do? Okay, so these are not actually simple questions. In fact, they cut to the core of who we are as humans, and tackling them sent me on a pretty wild journey across hundreds of thousands of years in different countries and through disciplines ranging from psychology to anthropology to politics and even city planning. And it put me in the company of a lot of people I hadn't met before. Talking to strangers is good for us. So I want to start by introducing you to a friend I met. Her name is Nick, and she's a nurse in Las Vegas. And Nick had a really hard time as a kid. Her parents had a lot of problems, and kids at school were cruel to her, and that warped her, understandably. She told me, "I thought I was supposed to be afraid of everything." But at a certain point in her teen years, Nick went against this instinct and started talking to strangers. And she found, to her shock, that people were generally kind and receptive and interested in her. She found that it made her feel less lonely and happier and more hopeful, and that it was a lot of fun. She's now been doing this for decades, and she credits it for giving her the good life that she has today. As it turns out, scientists are finding that that effect wasn't unique to Nick. In a series of studies over the last few years, in which people were asked to chat up strangers on buses and subways, in waiting rooms or in coffee shops, psychologists have found again and again and again that the simple act of chatting with a stranger can make us feel happier and healthier, less lonely, and more connected to the places where we live. One psychologist even found that talking to strangers boosts our cognitive function, making us, in effect, smarter. It's that potent. Or as Nick told me, never underestimate the power of even the most minute positive connection. We're not sure strangers are people. Okay, so if talking to strangers is so good for us, why don't we do it more? There are a lot of answers to this question, ranging from a fear that it'll go badly to more insidious issues of race or class. But underpinning a lot of the fears we have about talking to strangers boils down to this. We don't talk to strangers because we're not entirely convinced that they are human. Or at least we don't think they're as human as we are. The psychologist Nicholas Epley, who's extensively studied interactions with strangers, came up with a theory that he calls the lesser minds problem. Basically, it works like this. Because we can't see what's going on in the head of a stranger, we have a tendency to assume that, well, there's just not much going on in there. And studies have backed this up. We chronically underestimate strangers' intelligence, their willpower, and their ability to feel emotions like pride and embarrassment and shame. This applies to all strangers, but it can become a lot more severe in times of strife or scarcity, or when leaders push us to dehumanize members of other groups, which is pretty dark. But there's a curious upside to lesser minds, and it's this. We actually expect very little from a conversation with a stranger. And as a result, it's easier for us to do than we expected, and we're frequently delighted to discover that the creature standing before us is in fact a human in full, with a complex mind and a rich life and a unique perspective and much to offer. Break the script. So back in 2019, as part of an effort to get really good at talking to strangers, I signed up for an unusual class. It was taught by a young woman named Georgie Nightingale. Georgie is a communications expert, and she has a lot of proven, scientifically backed tips on how to talk to strangers, which I get into in the book. But my favorite one is this, and it's called breaking the script. All right, so what's a script? Well, when we interact with people, we often use something called a script. This is a way to acknowledge the other person without expending any real time or effort into actually talking to them. So say I go into the store and the cashier says, "How you doing?" And I say, "I'm good, how are you?" And he says, "Fine, thanks." And it goes no further than that. That's not a conversation. That's a script. So Georgie's idea is to break the script. And she does this by responding to a scripted question with a specific and sincere answer. So if the cashier says, "How you doing?" Georgie doesn't say fine. She says, "Well, I'd say I'm about a 7 out of 10. How are you?" And now the cashier is going to be a little thrown by this because he didn't expect it. But humans tend to follow one another's lead in a conversation. So when he answers her, he'll likely do it numerically. "I'm an 8, he'll say. And Georgie will say, "Well, what will it take you to get to a 9? And like that, a little connection has been made. They're sharing a little bit of what it's like to be them. A conversation has begun, and they are well on their way to reaping the benefits of talking to strangers. Talking to strangers is the cornerstone of human civilization. So let's go back a ways. About 12,000 years ago, when humans shifted to farming, a lot of men who were previously hunters suddenly found themselves with little to do. According to the British archaeologist Martin Jones, who studies ancient DNA, these idle men set out into the wilderness to find their place. In effect, they became wanderers, or they became strangers. Now, prior to the dawn of agriculture, they wouldn't have made it very far. But since people had settled down, their settlements came to function like a network of way stations. How? Let me paint you a picture. A strange man approaches a settlement. Now he's putting himself in danger by doing this, but he needs food and shelter. And when the people in the settlement see him, they're wary. He might be a threat, after all. But at the same time, he might know something useful or interesting, or he might just be a potential mate or good company, just a way to break up the monotony. So these strangers and these settlers had to devise a way to reconcile threat with opportunity. And the way they did it was through what we now know as hospitality. These settlers would take the stranger in and offer him food and shelter, making him indebted to them, while also talking to him and giving him a chance to demonstrate that he was not dangerous, that he was not of a lesser mind, but he had something to offer. And once both sides felt comfortable, a relationship could form. In short order, thanks to hospitality, social networks exploded, and humans suddenly traveled farther than they ever had before. This sort of hospitality, often to strangers, became, according to Martin Jones, nothing less than the cornerstone of civilization. Friction makes us social. Why are some places friendly to strangers while others are cold? At first, I assumed that really safe, well-run countries would be the friendliest. After all, if strangers don't pose any particular threat, then you're more likely to talk to them. But as it turns out, the opposite is often true. While doing this book, I met a political scientist named Una Blaher de la Garza, and she contrasted life in, say, Norway with life in her native Mexico. Quote, "Norwegians don't really have to rely on people being trustworthy because the state functions so smoothly. You end up in a situation where you simply don't need others to go about your day," she says. But in Mexico, she adds, "You need to interact with others for everyday exchanges. You need to address them, to ask for help, or for directions." Unquote. And in that way, friction forces people to be friendly. You can see it in other ways, too. Research into a phenomenon called smiling cultures has found that people in places that have a long history of immigration tend to be friendlier and more emotionally expressive and more attuned to one another than people in more homogeneous societies. That's because for centuries, people in these cultures could not assume that the stranger before them could speak the language well or understand the cultural shorthand. So they had to devise a way to communicate that they were friendly. And they did this by speaking, of course, but they also did it by smiling more, laughing more, and generally being more animated, more responsive to each other. And it worked. For these cultures, and I would argue for our own, talking to strangers isn't just a way to live, it's a way to survive.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, listeners, you can get yourself a copy of The Power of Strangers at your favorite bookstore. And if you got something out of today's show, please leave us a rating or review to help others find it. That does it for us this week. These episodes were written by me, Michael Kovnat, and edited by Caleb Bissinger. The Next Big Idea Daily is part of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. We'll see you Monday.